to The Book of Life, a show about Jewish books, music, film, and web. I'm Heidi Estrin. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida. Additional support comes from the Association of Jewish Libraries. Kathy Kacer has written many books that deal with the Holocaust for middle grade readers. Recently, she won the National Jewish Book Award and the Canadian Jewish Book Award for her novel The Diary of Laura's Twin. The Book of Life's Canadian correspondent, Anne Dublin, met up with Kathy Kacer in her native Toronto.
Kathy Kacer is a children's author whose focus is historical fiction and true stories about the Holocaust. She's dedicated to writing about the Holocaust in a way that is sensitive to the age and stage of development of a young reader. A winner of numerous awards and honors, Kathy has written unforgettable stories inspired by real events. Her novels are stories of hope, courage, and humanity in the face of overwhelming adversity. On a cool, sunny day in October, I drove to Kathy's house in Toronto for this interview. Kathy, I'd like to begin by asking you some questions about your childhood. Where did you grow up?
Well, I was born here in Toronto. I realize these days that we don't meet many people that are actually born and raised in Toronto. My parents settled here in the early 1950s. And I was born here, grew up here, spent most of my life here, except for a few brief stints away at university and other places, but this is where I'm from.
Do you remember your childhood vividly? And if so, does it inform your writing?
Oh, you know, it absolutely informs my writing, and I think certainly the part that influenced me the most was the fact that my parents were Eastern European immigrants living in Toronto in the early 1950s and 60s, and always struggling with how to fit in a culture and lifestyle that was really so completely foreign to them. They arrived in Toronto not speaking the language, looking and feeling completely out of place. They formed a really close friendship and community with other Eastern European Holocaust survivors, so that was the community that I really grew up in. And how could that not influence you? From the food that I was fed, to the playmates that I had, to the discussions that went on in the background, to everything from, you know, the fears and anxieties that govern kind of the life that we lived in. I think so much of that has found its way into my writing in little bits and pieces scattered throughout every single one of my books.
Did your parents talk about their experiences during the Holocaust or before the Holocaust?
My parents were talkers, you know, and when I talk to kids in schools and libraries about, and when I talk to adults about, you know, this time period, I always make that distinction because, as you know, there are really sort of two groups of survivors, those that find it far too painful to share their experiences and those that talk openly about their experiences. And my parents were firmly in the talking about their experience side of that. My mother survived the war in hiding with her mother and her younger brother. And so all of those stories are about the secret of Gabby's dresser and the night spies, and that really was her life. My father was a survivor of the camps, and while he was extremely open about his experiences in the camps, I found it more difficult to write about that. I actually have one short story in this new collection of short stories that's coming out with Penguin Books, actually, this collection called Whispers. I have finally done one short story about my father. Before that, because of the age group that I write for, it's been difficult to find the stories about my father's life that I felt that I could really recreate. But yeah, they were talkers from day one. I mean, I was raised on concentration camp stories. They're like bedtime stories to me, how odd, when I think back on it. But
yeah,
it was all there.
Where other children grew up with Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan.
And Happily Ever After.
Yes,
And yeah.
there was very little happily ever after from the Holocaust. What did you want to be when you grew up?
I wasn't sure. I loved writing from an early age, and I talked at one point, I remember, with my parents about wanting to write, and they kind of vetoed that idea. They really, they really wanted me to go to university and become the doctor or lawyer that they didn't have in the family. So even though they loved the arts, I was a child who was taken to the ballet and the opera, from a young age. I mean, I really grew up immersed in the arts. They didn't see that as a viable career for me. So I had this love of writing, and I kind of floundered with what I wanted to do with that and what I wanted to do with anything else. And really I was a good student, made my way to university, and arrived at university really not knowing what I wanted to do, and then kind of drifted into psychology, which is what I ended up studying, not realizing that would be my career path, but that's kind of where I started.
How did that career as a psychologist affect or influence your writing, if it did?
Well, I know that it does. I know that it did. I'm not sure I can even define how it does or how it did in the early stages. But like everything that we've done in our past, somehow it seeps its way into our lives. And I worked as a psychologist for 20 years and worked with troubled adolescents and their families. I loved it. I mean, I worked in all of the children's mental health centers of Toronto. I was the clinical director of a place called the Griffin Center for 5 years here in North York, working with really difficult kids. So I loved it all, and I know that the work that I did for those 20 years influences everything that I do today. How I speak with kids when I'm in a school or a library, how I write about character in my stories, how I resolve conflict within my characters, how I provide tension to a story. It has to be a part of what I learned and what I thought about all these years. I'm not sure how, because I think it is just a part of how I think and write. But I just know it has to be there.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It makes me think that maybe every writer should be a psychologist, or maybe every writer becomes one. I'm going to ask you some general questions now, and then we'll get to some specific ones about each of your books.
Okay.
So, firstly, how, where, when do you usually like to write?
Well, I have a beautiful writing space. I'm all about writing space. I think it is extremely important. I always say that to, when I work with students, I always say writing space is just such an important thing. I'll show it to you afterwards. I have a beautiful writing space in the front of the house with lots of light, lots of things on the wall, pictures, some of the awards that I've been lucky enough to get. I sort of surround myself with like the writing world. I like to write during the day, but I've always been not at night. I'm always a daytime person, and early mornings are always best for me. So I do my best writing between kind of 9 and 2. And as I said to you earlier, I've taken advantage of the outdoors as well. So I do great writing in my backyard, which is my haven and my oasis. So in the summer months, this is where I spend my time writing as well. It's all about kind of creating that space where you can just think your best thoughts and think as broadly, beyond the page as you possibly can, and kind of evoking all of that or invoking all of that so that it finds its way onto the pages.
That's really fascinating. It sounds like you're quite a disciplined person. So do you write every day?
I'm extremely disciplined. I think, you can't work at home and make it work unless you're a disciplined, sort of focused person. And I must say I am that. I write Every day. Do I write every day? Well, when I can, yes. I do a lot of speaking outside as well, and so certain times of the year are busier than others. So I try to preserve kind of 2 to 3 days a week when I can just be writing, and then it's kind of 2 to 3 days when I'm out speaking and doing other things. But if I don't have like a good 2 to 3 days a week, then I'm sort of feeling like I'm behind the 8 ball when it comes to my work.
Can you tell us a bit about your writing process? For example, where do you get the ideas? Do you make an outline first? Just whatever you want to tell us about it.
Okay. Well, the ideas are not hard to get, and as you know, given that I write about the Holocaust, I feel like I have 4 or 5 story ideas that are just sitting there waiting for me to get to them at some point. And they're all based on stories that have come to me either directly through survivors or because I've read something in the paper that's really intrigued me, or I've read something in history that's really intrigued me. So the ideas are all, they're there, in that history. And there are too many of them for any of us to ever get to completely. So I never feel that I'm at a loss for ideas. My process is kind of as disciplined as my day. I do make outlines. I think over the years I've become even more meticulous about my outlines. They used to be really brief, kind of just sort of a 2-page very general outline. Now I do chapter by chapter outlines and really detailed ones. So for the book that I'm working on now, and I'll tell you about it at some point, I think I ended up with kind of a 50-page chapter by chapter outline, where I even put in, if lines come to me, in the middle of a sort of a chapter breakdown, I'll write out particular pieces of dialogue that I think I'm going to include later on within that chapter. So I end up with a really comprehensive document. And that's my blueprint. And of course, it changes, it grows, it lengthens, it gets moved around, things get collapsed, all of that stuff. But I'm feeling more and more like I can't work without that blueprint. And I find it extremely valuable. I know that there are writers who will say that the story has to kind of lead itself, and I don't get that at all. While I respect their writing process, it's just not mine at all. I work from those kinds of details on.
Well, the important thing is to find a way that works for you.
Yes.
To respect that and own it.
Yeah.
And use it.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about something else. When you're writing, do you write with a child or a young adult audience specifically in mind? Or do you write the story you're led to tell with no particular reader in mind?
Yeah, I don't think about age of the audience when I'm writing. I really am just thinking about the story that I want to tell. The only time that I really think I thought specifically about audience was when I did that Our Canadian Girl series for Penguin Books. And that's because, the directive was so specific. It was targeted for a particular age group, and it had a word limit on each book. So it was the first time that I really had to think about all of those elements, including even the language that I was using, the complexity of the language that I was using. Other than that time, I just write stories, and I don't think about language. I always think about content because I know I'm writing for a young readership, whatever that means. So I'm careful about how I tell stories. But at the end of the day, we sort of look at it and say, okay, now where would this fit in the spectrum of young readers? And that's where it kind of goes. As you know, I'm continually amazed at the sophistication of young adult books. And so I also don't want to underestimate my audience. And for me, it's just, and Margie at Second Story says this all the time, it's all about a good story. Tell a good story, and it will find its audience. And don't play down to your readers, don't play up to your readers, just talk to your readers and they will respond. And as you know, I'm always amazed at young people and how they are able to absorb even difficult stories. And so it's just all about that.
I want to ask you about adapting your books to the stage.
Right.
Your first book, The Secret of Gabby's Dresser, has been turned into a play. It's had 3 successful runs, and it's been shown to over 20,000 people. What's it like to see your words come to life on the stage in an entirely different medium?
Well, and don't forget, I wrote the play. So I did the adaptation in that case. Writing the play was the most difficult, probably the most difficult and most rewarding thing that I've ever done. The play was optioned by Helena Fine, who is in Toronto, who focuses on a lot of Holocaust stories to adapt to the stage. And what Helena did was she hired a director / dramaturge and cast the play, and then we workshopped it for several weeks. So I would, I had a rough kind of play that I'd written, and I would bring scenes in every single day to the group of actors, and we would run these scenes with the actors then sort of going off on their own improvisation. And we do a whole bunch of these scenes, and we do this from 10 in the morning till about 6 at night, and then I would go home that day and then rewrite all of those scenes, taking bits and pieces of what they had said, what I had thought, completely reworking them, often working, and this is not my style, but often working till 2 or 3 in the morning, and then, photocopying the new versions and bringing them in the next morning so that we could work them again. And we did that for several weeks while this play kind of evolved. So at the end of the day, we had this play, which I was incredibly proud of. It nearly killed me to do the writing of it because it was what felt like this 24-hour process, 7 days a week almost. The end result was different from the book, which I wanted it to be. It couldn't be the book. It needed to be something different. Still had the heart of the book, which is what I did want it to have. And the group of actors that were involved in it were so fully invested themselves personally because they had been a part of the process along with me. So, on so many levels, to see it on stage was just such an amazing experience. We had an opening night. And I just think I sobbed my way through the entire play. At the very end, Helena introduced me in the audience. I didn't even want to stand because I just looked like a complete wreck out there. I just thought, how can this be? I'm like crying at my own work, my own words. But it was just like my soul had been there on stage along with everybody else. So it was fabulous. And the fact that so many kids and adults came out to see it over those 3 runs, it was part of it was a joint venture between several school boards and Helena's theater company. So that enabled all these students to come out on a regular basis. The feedback was great. Kids loved it, and it brought this story to them in just a completely different way. Again, a story that I think had touched many kids earlier on when it first came out as a book was now touching them in a different way as a play. So it was terrific.
And these things work back and forth because, of course, kids who see the play then would want to read your book.
Yes.
Or other books
yes,
you wrote.
Absolutely.
Or other authors have written about
right.
the Holocaust. So it just keeps growing and growing, doesn't it?
Yeah, no question. It always kind of feeds back and forth. And I have 2 of my books that have been optioned for film now, Clara's War and The Diary of Laura's Twin. I'm not writing the screenplay for these, and really am quite hands-off when it comes to the process. So it will be really interesting to see how I respond to the end result for these 2 where I've not been part of the process of kind of transitioning it to the other medium. I'm very curious.
And probably a little nervous,
Maybe
too.
a little nervous. I like the producers' in both of these cases and the sort of creative teams that they have and the ideas that they have about the stories. So I'm very trusting of what they're going to do, but yes, it will be certainly a different process to see it unfold.
I have one more general question, and then we'll get to some specifics. Kathy, you've received many awards and honors for your writing. Is there one in particular that meant the most to you?
I love all the Tree Awards in Canada. They're phenomenal, and even to be nominated for one of those, it just means that the exposure for your work is so great. And we all struggle with exposure for our work, how it kind of drifts through to something that is noticed by as many people as possible. And the Tree Awards make that possible for us. This year, I won 2 awards that were really unusual for me and really took me aback, I think, because it meant a completely different market. So one was the Jewish Book Award in the U.S., which, as I said, just, for your work to be noticed in another country, and particularly the United States, where there are so many more books than we have here, for it to be noticed there, I was completely overwhelmed.
What was that for, Kathy?
That was for The Diary of Laura's Twin. So completely overwhelmed. And I went down to New York for the awards ceremony, and it was just a phenomenal experience from start to finish, from meeting the people that were involved to being handed the award to being, part of that community in the United States. Amazing. The other one was the Yad Vashem Award for Children's Holocaust Literature in Israel, and that was for Hiding Edith, which I just won this last year. And again, for a Holocaust story written in Canada to find its way to kind of the top of the list, I guess, in Israel meant so much to me. Again, I was just so completely taken aback by that and so overwhelmed by the honor. So all of them are great. It's hard to put one above the other, but certainly those 2 were just so completely unexpected, I think, for me. I just really was so honored.
Kathy, I've read and enjoyed many of your books. I have some specific questions for you about your books of historical fiction.
Sure.
Let's start with those. The very first book you wrote was The Secret of Gabby's Dresser. Can you tell us how it came about? What was that road to publication that you traveled upon?
Right, for the very first, always the hardest, right? Well, that story that the book is based on, the story of how my mother hid in a dresser that was in her mother's dining room. When I said earlier that I was raised on stories of the Holocaust, that was probably the one that stood out the most for me as a child. The story that I wanted to hear most often at night. It was a story that, obviously, even though it was somewhat terrifying, the thought of a child being enclosed in a dresser, Nazi soldiers around, the possibility of arrest. For me, it was also a story that was so filled with adventure and excitement and mystery and heroism and all of those elements of a great story. And I always say that I think my mother must have had some innate sensitivity about how to tell stories to me as a child, because I just latched on to that one. And always had this feeling that someday I would have to do something with that story. And when my children were young, it was the story that I wanted to tell them in the way that my mother had told it to me. And so it really sort of started from that. I was telling the story to my children. I decided one day to write it. I wrote it down as a short story. And on a whim, as many writers, would-be writers do, I just sent it out to a whole bunch of publishers. And I got many rejection letters.
Don't we all?
Yes, I have my file full of rejection letters. But I had 2 really positive responses. One from a publishing company in the U.S. and one from a publisher in Toronto. And the publisher in Toronto was, of course, Margie Wolf at Second Story Press. And what she said to me was that she was not ready to publish the book, not even ready to say that she might even publish the book, but she was interested enough in it that she thought I should work at it and resubmit it to her. It was a short story when I first wrote it. I didn't really even know what it was going to be or what it, how it was going to turn out. And so I really latched onto that and spent about the next year, I think, writing it as a novel for young readers, and then resubmitted it to Margie, no one else. Waited, I think, about another year. That was the day that really kind of changed the course of my life at that point. I had stopped working as a psychologist. At a certain stage of my life, just really felt that if I didn't give the writing thing a chance, it just wasn't going to happen for me. And it was in that period of time that the offer from Margie came along.
Let's talk about Clara's War first. What was your inspiration for writing that book? Story about some children who were sent to Terezin, the concentration camp near Prague. Tell us how you developed that story, where it came from.
And the children who are sent there for the purpose of the story participate in a children's opera that was performed in Terezin at that time, an opera called Brundibar. The inspiration for that was that my daughter Gabby performed in an English version of Brundibar when she was a child. Again, a play that was produced by Helena Fine in her theater company. And Gabby at the time was, I think, 9 or 10 years old, and she was a singer with a children's choir in Toronto, and these notices of auditions came out, and I took Gabby for the audition. I knew nothing about Terezin at the time. Really, I shouldn't say nothing. Very little about Terezin at the time. I knew nothing about Brundibar at the time. And Gabby got a lovely role in the play. And John Freund, who is a survivor who lives in Toronto, was attached to that project because as someone who had survived Terezin and later Auschwitz, he knew the story of Brundibar, and actually he's one of the people that sort of brought that story to Helena and brought the play to Helena so that she would do it in Toronto. So John sent a letter to all of the children who were participants in the opera, the English version here in Toronto, explaining a little bit about his background and his having seen the play as a child in Terezin and the background of that experience. And I remember at the time, Gabby kind of read the letter, put it aside, went back to studying her lines for the play. I picked up the letter, read it, and thought, this is a remarkable story. This is a remarkable story. This is something I must do at some point. Again, with the same sort of feeling that I had when I knew the story of Gabby's Dresser. And really, almost immediately after finishing Gabby's Dresser, I launched into beginning the research for Clara's War, because I just knew that was another story that would, just grab kids, and it was a story that needed to be told. So that's how we did it.
Well, I think if it grabs you first,
yes,
you have to feel passionate about the story that you're telling.
Right.
Then you can perhaps tell it to children.
Right.
I think the passion has to be there.
Absolutely.
And a commitment, because to research and write a book takes how long? At least a year?
Yeah, I always say, it's a 2-year, and I'm a fast writer, so it's a 2-year process, sort of start to finish.
Let's talk about your latest book of fiction, The Diary of Laura's Twin.
Right.
Now that takes place simultaneously, you could say, in the Warsaw Ghetto and in contemporary times. Can you tell us how you got the idea for developing that book?
Right. I have to say, I've said to a number of people that I think The Diary of Laura's Twin may be my best writing to date. The process of writing that book was so fantastic. Even the process of editing it was so great. Peter Carver was my editor on that book.
Lucky.
Lucky me. A little daunting at the beginning, and it was a fabulous, fabulous experience. So the story, again, actually came to me from Margie. Margie had attended a twinning ceremony for a bat mitzvah in Toronto. And for those of your readers who don't know, a twinning ceremony, these are ceremonies that now take place across North America, where young people are twinned, are linked with a child of the Holocaust, someone who didn't have the opportunity to celebrate his or her bat mitzvah. And so this is an opportunity through the celebration of your own ceremony to honor a child of the Holocaust. So Margie had attended a twinning ceremony, and she and I were meeting one day, and she said, you know, this would be a fantastic idea for a book. One day you should do this. And that was years ago, and I kind of sat with it thinking, that would be a really interesting sort of premise, but what would I do with that? You know, how would I really construct that? And really just kind of didn't know what I was going to do with it for the longest time. And what I did know is that at some point I did want to write a book that had to do with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. That was just an interesting and really important time in history that I wanted to somehow do in a book at some point in the future. And I'm not even sure when, but somehow the idea of linking those two events came to me. Telling the story of the Warsaw Ghetto through a child who was alive at that time, and linking that child to a contemporary child today through the twinning ceremony is really the premise for that book. I love the ghetto story because I actually wrote that portion of the book in longhand in a journal, as if I were writing a diary. So really immersing myself in the voice of Sarah Gittler, who is my child in the ghetto. And the contemporary part was so important to me because, you know, one of the things I always struggle with is how to make these stories meaningful for young people today. So I thought that creating this contemporary voice would be just that wonderful way of connecting with young readers today. She becomes their guide back to history, as opposed to sort of me being the writer. She's almost the writer in this case. She takes young readers back in history and then forward in time. And so when that premise kind of gelled, I just knew that was going to work. You know, that great feeling when you know it's going to work. The outline fell in place so easily, back and forth. I struggled with the ending a little bit, how to link these characters again in a meaningful way. And when that realization of how I could do it came to me, it was that kind of great aha, oh, that's the way I'm going to do it moment. And it worked. It worked without feeling too contrived or anything. I'm not even going to tell you, for those of you who haven't read it, I'm not even going to tell you how they do connect. So that was, you know, talk about a great experience of writing. It really, that one from start to finish. Sometimes we labor over our writing. Other times it just comes so easily. That was one that just came easily. And so I love it. Love the final product.
I'd like to ask you some questions now about your historical nonfiction.
Right.
Again, these are books that are based on real events and some real characters. I can see a massive amount of research that has gone into each one of them. Let's talk about the underground reporters first. What was the inspiration for this book? Let's have your point of view about it. You're the writer.
Well, yes, John Freund, who has, happily become such a dear friend of mine as well over the years. When I was working on Clara's War, John being the one involved in Brundabar and the survivor of Terezin and Auschwitz, I brought John an early manuscript, version of the manuscript of Clara's War, wanting him to read it and really help me see whether the context for that story that I had created was close enough to his memory of truth of that place. And so he was very helpful. Read it a few times, really talked openly about what didn't work, what did work, what was too Pollyanna-ish, what was not real enough, and really helped me kind of reconstruct Clara's War. And one day, as I was sitting in his apartment, he said, "I've got something to show you. Let me get something." And he went into a back room, came back with this box that he plunked down in front of me, and inside this box were copies of this newspaper, written in Czech, that he went on to tell me had been written by himself and a group of young children in his town in what is now the Czech Republic, at a time when all of their freedoms and privileges had been taken away as the war was approaching. And he and a group of about 60 children had written this collection of newspapers over the course of 2 years. And he handed me a few of them and said, maybe you can do something with these. And of course, my jaw fell to the ground because these newspapers were a remarkable collection of writing by young Jewish children at that time. The stories that they had constructed in these papers, the newspapers themselves with drawings and cartoons and jokes and songs and poems and sports articles were all there. It was like looking at their lives over the course of 2 years, pictures of them interspersed in the pages of the papers as well. I was working on Claire's War at the time, and I was committed to writing the sequel to Gabby's Dresser. So I knew that I couldn't do this right away, but I wanted to do it. So I made him promise that he would hold on to this for me until I was ready to write the book that I wanted to write about the newspapers. And he did. And, about 2 years passed before I came back to him and said, now I'm ready to do it. And that's how we began the process of writing The Underground Reporters, which is the story of these young people who wrote these newspapers in his town as the war was approaching.
Well, what I found fascinating about the book was not only the story you told, but the story that the children told through their newspaper. And the stories, the poems, the songs, as you say, the photos, and the drawings.
Well, that was it. It's their strength. And their, these are children, remember. So even in the midst of horrible circumstances, the resilience of children is always so remarkable. Their strength, their optimism, their humor, their desire to learn and explore is there in the pages of the papers. And, John had done a huge amount of work already in translating, the stories are written in Czech, in translating so many of the articles and stories for me. So he really was my collaborator on this one. And he, as I said, is a phenomenal person and such a wonderful spokesperson for his history and this history of Terezín and the circumstances in the Czech Republic in particular. So it was really a delight to work on that story.
Let's segue then into another story about children who managed to cope and survive during that horrible time that was the Holocaust. In your book, Hiding Edith, you tell the story of a group of children who are hidden by an entire village in France. So can you tell us where you got the inspiration for that book?
Yeah, inspirations are so great, aren't they? These are just moments that happen. And for me, they're moments. And then you kind of hang on to them until they germinate into something bigger. And that's what happened with Hiding Edith. It was during the run of The Secret of Gabby's Dresser. At the end of every play, Helena would have a survivor present to go on stage for the young audience that was there, tell a very brief synopsis of their own survival history, and answer questions from the kids. So it was almost as if, this is one version back here on the stage that you've already seen. Here I am, a living person who has experienced something like this. Let me tell you my story, which I thought was a wonderful thing. She had a survivor for every single showing of the play. And one day it was this lovely French woman whose name is Edith Gelbar. And Edith, in 5 minutes, told this brief synopsis of her story of having been hidden in this school in the southern part of France during the war. And I was sitting in the audience, and I just kind of sat up in my chair, and I thought, that's a story that I have to write. That's at some point the next one. And I went up to Edith afterwards and introduced myself and said, I'm going to call you. I'm not sure when, but at some point I'd like to come and talk to you about your story. I think it would be something I'd be interested in doing. And so that's what it became for me, that, the unfolding of that. And the piece of Edith's story that really intrigued me, there were a couple things. One was, again, I'd been so interested at some point in doing a story about a hidden child. The phenomenon of not only hiding physically, but hiding one's identity and what that must do for children. I really wanted to explore that. Maybe that is a part of my psychology background, but I really wanted to explore that in writing. And the second part that intrigued me about her story was the fact, it was the part about the goodness of people, what the possibility of what might have happened had more people become invested in helping their Jewish friends and neighbors. And so to me, this was a remarkable example of what was possible in the world, even at that time. And so I really wanted to highlight that and champion it for young readers. So, when you tell these stories, especially for young kids and in a school setting, that whole issue of, okay, so what can we take out of this that informs us and teaches us something? Certainly we need to know about the atrocities, but the part that you can take out of it that really can help you as a person is how you lead your life today and what you can do for your friends and neighbors today. And that's a universal concept. That doesn't have to do with the Holocaust. That just has to do with being a good person. And so any time that I can capture that and highlight it for kids, I grab the moment. And this story for me really, really did that. Asking them, what kind of person do you want to be in the world that you're a part of creating for the future? And here's an example of what's possible. Take from this and lead your life accordingly.
Kathy, I'd like to talk a bit about your most recent series of historical nonfiction. It's a series that you're writing with Canadian author Sharon Mackay. These 3 books contain stories of young people caught in the nightmare of the Holocaust. The first book of the series is called Whispers from the Ghettos. And I have to tell you, I read it and I could not put it down.
Oh,
every story had a unique voice. Mm-hmm. Every story was a unique one and yet a universal one. So this was, I'm sure, an enormous project. 3 books. How and why did you decide to undertake this huge task?
Yeah, I look back on it now and I think, how did we ever do it as well? It was, in retrospect, it was even more enormous than we thought it was going to be when we started. The idea was Sharon's completely. She called me and said, I have this idea about short stories from survivors, a collection of them. And I said to her, great idea, go for it. And she said to me, not me, you. I have this idea for you to write this collection. And I thought about it and I said, I'd love to write this collection, but I can't do it alone. Let's do it together. And that's kind of how we decided to do it together. Sharon is not Jewish, but she is hugely interested in this history. She's part of the Christian-Jewish dialogue of, I want to say Ontario, but I may be wrong about that. It's an organization that looks at programs between the Christian and Jewish community. She always brings survivors into her local church. She wrote a wonderful story called Esther about a Jewish girl in France in the 1700s. So she really is very interested in this history and also is hesitant to write about it because it isn't her background, although I don't think that's a reason not to write about a particular history. So doing it together was great. Her writing style and mine are somewhat similar, although I think different enough that we have sort of different voices. We sat down and really thought about the stories that we were going to collect. And it was over time that we realized that we really had 3 books here, not one. I think we started out thinking we had 1 book of short stories, and then thought, no, we really do have kind of the evolution almost of the history of the Holocaust through these 3 books, Whispers from the Ghettos, Whispers from the Camps, and Whispers in Hiding. And the other reality that we grapple with, and that certainly I grapple with, is this kind of window of opportunity to capture stories from survivors of the Holocaust. And so the chance to take as many of those stories as possible and put them into one large collection really appealed to me. And then when we talked about how we were going to construct these short stories, obviously we weren't doing full life histories in these books because in this sort of format of short story writing. And so it boiled down for us to trying to find kind of the defining moment in the survivor story of each of the survivors that we were going to be interviewing. That's sort of the essence of the question that we asked each of them. Either the moment that made the difference for them, for surviving or not, or perhaps the saddest moment for them, the most joyful moment for them, the moment that stood out for them in their own survivor history. And, to get to that moment, though, you do have to interview someone and really discover their entire life in order to then pinpoint the moment that you extract from that, which was the moment that we sort of wrote about in the many short stories that we've collected. So it was really a huge, huge process of finding the survivors, interviewing each of them, finding the moments that we wanted to write about. And we also wanted not just to capture the stories of survivors in Toronto, but to try to sort of go as much across the country as we possibly, feasibly could. And so we do have survivors from Alberta, we have one in California, we have one in Israel, we have one in Winnipeg, a couple in Montreal, so one in Halifax, really tried to capture a number of the survivors from the community across Canada.
They're all extremely readable stories,
right.
And with a few of them I actually cried while I was reading them. So I have to ask you,
okay.
When you were writing these stories, do you ever cry? Is it hard to write them, or can you sort of detach yourself from them as the writer / observer?
I'm often asked if I don't get horribly depressed, if I'm not always depressed by the writing that I do, because many of the stories are so heart-wrenching, really, truly heart-wrenching. And you know what, Anne? If you don't cry with the people that you've interviewed, then I don't think you have come to the heart of their story. So I cry all the time when I'm interviewing survivors, when I'm thinking about their stories. It touches me deeply, deeply. And, at times I think it touches me because I also hear my parents' voice in every survivor that I meet. So I'm always in the midst of thinking about my own parents who are no longer here. So it touches me on that level as well. At the end of the day, I'm not depressed by the writing because I'm also so inspired by every survivor that I meet, their strength, their resilience, their humor, but it's the full range of emotions. I'm not at all detached when I meet them and interview them. I feel a little bit, in the absence of my own parents, that I have become the child of all of the survivors that I've interviewed over the years as well.
Well, one of the things I admire most about you is the fact that you go out in the world and speak to children and adults about the Holocaust. Why do you do that? Why do you go and speak to audiences everywhere? I mean, some writers just stay in their study, scribbling away, and they don't even really enjoy doing presentations. Why are you out there in the world?
I do love an audience. I have, quite aside from the content of my writing, I'm comfortable speaking to groups. I love an audience. I think I have a little bit of the actor in me as well, and it does take that, when you're when you're standing in front of a group of kids. I never wanted to be a teacher, but I love the opportunity to have those moments with kids. I have the best moments with kids because I'm only there for an hour. I can hold their attention for that short period of time and not have to deal with anything else except that moment that we have together. That's magical for me, really magical for me.
Okay, I have a few more questions for you, Kathy. If you had to give any advice to an aspiring author, what advice would you give?
Well, I think I give the same advice that all writers give. Certainly when it comes to writing children's books, I think that you can't possibly think you're going to be able to write a children's book if you don't read children's books. So not just reading in general, but reading children's books. And the other thing is that, again, because I write from such personal stories, I do believe, I think there's nothing new in what I'm suggesting, but I do believe that the best stories, the richest stories, come from our own histories. And it doesn't mean that you have to have mine or that it has to be an era that is about history, but it is about, those moments that you look back on, the most joyful moments, the saddest moments, whether it was the picnics you took with your family, the family vacation, a death in the family, your pet, whatever those moments were, that's where I think the writing has to begin. Not out there with something completely new and different, but in there with what is most meaningful to you and what you can write about with the greatest truth and the breadth of all of your senses involved in understanding those times. And if you start from that, I think that the other kind of bigger stories can come. But I think it starts with your own truth.
Kathy, can you tell us about any new titles or projects you're working on right now?
Believe it or not, I'm writing my first adult book. I've been working on this for a couple of years now, and this is going to be a Second Story Press book as well. This is a great story. Came to me again a long time ago, I think maybe 6 or 7 years ago. It's a story about stolen art in Czechoslovakia during the war. It's a story about a family in Czechoslovakia who acquired some priceless oil paintings. When the war was approaching, they gave the paintings to some trusted family friend and managed to get out of the country. And then it's the story of their trying to come back and reclaim the artwork 50 years later. And it involves the Canadian Embassy in Prague that actually harbored this artwork at one point, and it involves an art thief that helped smuggle the paintings out of then communist Czechoslovakia at another point. I mean, it's just filled with kind of intrigue and espionage, and it spans 2 continents and 50 years and several generations. So it's a big book, big story. And this very much is a story of family restitution, as you said. I mean, that's really the overriding theme of this book. It happens to be about paintings, but the story is really a story of family restitution.
Is there something you wish interviewers would ask you but never do? If so, here's your chance.
My mother died before The Secret of Gabby's Dresser was ever published. And so no one's ever asked me what she would have thought about that book or about this career that I have, this second career that I have really created, starting with her story. And it is something with my grandmother as well, I imagine, because she is also such an important part of that. And it's a question that I do think about a lot. My grandmother was a very kind of out there woman. She kind of strutted like a peacock, and she would have loved any and all attention that would have come to her out of that story and subsequently out of my writing career. She would have seen herself as the hero of it all and would have taken credit for it all. My mother was very unassuming, and even though she talked openly about her life, she was in many ways very private about her life as well. And I sometimes wonder what it would have meant to her to have her life so publicly out there in the world. I think she would love the fact that children are learning about her and this history through the story. I think she would have been unbelievably proud of me for creating a second career out of her life, I guess. I think she would have been humbled and embarrassed.
Well, I think, Kathy, that you did her proud. You did her story proud and her life, and you honored her by writing this book, which has touched so many people everywhere in the world.
Right. It's really been, I guess, a driving inspiration.
Yeah. Well, Kathy Kacer, thank you very much for sharing your insight about writing, about the writing process, about your wonderful books that you've written and hope to write. I realize now that you and I have a lot more in common than I knew when we first started out.
We do.
Thank you so much for sharing today.
Oh, my pleasure, Anne. Thank you.
There are so many ways to connect with the Book of Life. Fan us at facebook.com/Book of Life Podcast. Follow us at twitter.com/Book of Life Pod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com and listen to the latest episode by phone at 916-313-3820. And of course, find links to everything at bookoflifepodcast.com. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida at cbiboca.org and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilachmakers Klezmer String Band at freilachmakers.com. Thanks for listening and happy reading.